In this session of Sushasan, we have with us someone who has had the best education possible. He studied at Yale University and the Harvard Business School. Somebody who's been the pioneer for the private equity industry in India. And somebody who for the last 12 years is fully invested and working in the impact space in the country closely with the government. I'm talking about Ashish Dhawan. Ashish Dhawan was the founder of Chris Capital. He is the founder and trustee of Ashoka University, the founder of Central Square Foundation, the founder of the Convergence Foundation, and also the advisor, the global advisor to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In this episode of Sushasan, Ashish talks about what India needs to do in school education, what India should do in higher education, what India should do for economic development. And he shares why he believes the next 3 decades are India's decades. He also makes an appeal to the youth, the bright talent out there, the best talent out there, to work in the impact space and contribute to nation building. Watch out this and much more in this episode of Sushasan with Ashish Dhawan. Hi Ashish, welcome to Sushasan, and the objective behind Sushasan is really the audience is the young talent out there, the bright talent, the best minds in the country, and really inspire them to work in the impact space. It could be inside the government, outside the government, with the government, but that's the idea. You are somebody who's been successfully doing that for more than 10 years now. You had the option to do anything. You had a successful career in private equity, but you chose to kind of work in this space and you've done really well here. So really looking forward to this conversation, to unpacking a lot of what you have done in the impact space. I know your journey has been incredible, from Kolkata to the United States, back to India with Chris Capital Private Equity, and then a full-time for more than 10 years now in the structured strategic philanthropy space, as I like to call it.
Thank you. I'm excited.
So many things to talk about, Ashish. Let me start with things that are relatively more recent, things that have happened in the last 1 year or so. You are now on the advisory board of the Gates Foundation globally. It's one of the largest and the most visible philanthropic foundations in the world. And you're advising directly Bill Gates and Melinda Gates on how do they use and deploy their huge amount of wealth. And if I look at it, to me, it's a very important milestone. If you look at the structured strategic philanthropy space again in India, charity has been happening for millennia, for centuries, but this is a nascent space. And if I were to draw any parallel, my mind goes back 30 years or little less than 30 years when Rajat Gupta became the global managing partner and managing director of McKinsey & Company. That time management consulting was very nascent in India, and it's kind of really picked up significantly since then. To me, this is no less significant. How do you look at this role of yours on the global stage with the Gates Foundation?
Look, I think the Gates Foundation already has a significant presence in India. They've been doing work for a couple of decades. They are the largest foundation globally. I think for me personally, it's to get a bird's eye view to what's happening globally in a very structured, organized way with some of the brightest minds working on very difficult, complex problems. They specifically chose to work on health in India, but then expanded the work to global development. So covering agriculture, financial inclusion, sanitation, a number of areas. And then eventually through their global education effort, started to look at education as well. So fairly comprehensive. So one is it's multi-sectoral, but extremely strategic, extremely system reform oriented, a good sort of partnership approach, whether it's working with scientists on upstream R&D, down to I know working with Samabra on a number of projects as well in terms of implementation with the state governments. So it's this idea of you pick an issue, you want to drive change over a long period of time, like reducing infant mortality, say in Uttar Pradesh. And really the state is the main actor. But find innovative ways to work with state government, with the ecosystem of people doing research, to the implementation agencies, NGOs, community-based people, and you really control the program design, but work with partners to make it happen, and most importantly, work with state governments or governments to make it happen.
And what's the conceptual approach in terms of working with the government at the Gates Foundation? Of course, I've seen it in action, but from a thought, this thing, philosophical perspective, how does it happen? There's a certain theory of change that the foundation has, and then it's about advocating that with the governments in different countries or different state governments and so on. Or is it more about backing the agenda that the government may have, which overlaps with the agenda of the foundation? How does the foundation think about it at a very philosophical, conceptual level?
Yeah, look, this all predates me, so I think this is really, it's hard for me to comment directly on it. But from what I've seen, for whether it's the Gates Foundation or any, I think you always have clarity around the areas you want to impact. But you also respond to the needs of government. And frankly, I don't think there's that much dissonance, because if you want to reduce maternal mortality or infant mortality, you'll work on the areas that government wants to prioritize within those areas, but particularly ones that will actually turn the needle. You're not going to work on something that's completely orthogonal to it.
Yeah.
So I think the overlap happens quite naturally. In some cases, government also looks, because government's much smarter today, in terms of looking around across the world to see what's working and being able to absorb, or look at another state government and to be able to pull it in. So I think earlier, you had this phase where maybe government was doing something and outsiders could come and say, look, this is our agenda. I don't think that works, and neither is it as required, because I think government also has got its antenna up and really has a good sense of what's going on around the country and even around the world, to be honest.
You use the word extremely strategic, right, when you were describing the Gates Foundation. Just say more on that. Why do you feel that's the case, and what do you really mean by that?
Yeah, I think in terms of, even though, I think it's a lesson for all of us, is that I think even though they're so large, they are very focused on a few core objectives. So strategic from the perspective of picking some areas. And it's very easy to be all over the place, picking certain geographies to work in. I think working all the way from upstream to downstream. Most of us, at least I personally, would not even understand the technical stuff or the R&D work. So to work on R&D for vaccines, to then making sure you can contract with partners, and through all kinds of innovative agreements, to then making sure state governments or governments adopt it, and then last mile implementation, monitoring that feedback loop, and the long gestation to pull it off. I think very few people work across the whole value chain to make it happen, and often you sort of need that. But if you're a smaller philanthropist or have a smaller foundation, then you just pick one part of the value chain you want to work in, and you assume others are working further upstream or downstream in terms of the activity. But when you're much larger, I guess you can pick a particular topic and work across the value chain.
So in some sense, they're kind of focused, narrow in terms of geography, in terms of areas, but then there's very deep and full value chain as you're talking about. Got it. On a lighter note, how does this happen? How do you get on the advisory board for the Gates Foundation? Does Bill Gates kind of picks up the phone and calls you and says, okay, Ashish, you've done outstanding work in the last 10 years. You're kind of extremely strategic. You have a good perspective. We want you here to help us. Or I don't know if there's a process to it. You interact with 20 people and you are kind of seeing whether it's a good fit. They're seeing it's a good. How did it happen? How did it happen?
Look, I don't know why, to be honest. I think there are so many other people who are better qualified than I am. But I think it's also partly because we got to know the Gates Foundation a bit earlier. I mean, I had known people like Ashoka Alexander, Nachiket, and Girin earlier. But really, in terms of getting to know them properly, when the Gates Foundation set up this global education initiative, which Girin, who unfortunately passed away, he had encouraged the foundation after he'd led the work in India to set up this global education initiative. In that process, they met with Central Square Foundation, and that's how I interacted with them. So I had fairly deep interaction with Girin and team and many other folks at the foundation. When they decided to partner with Central Square Foundation, subsequently I met Bill, Melinda, Mark Susman, many others, Ankur, who runs strategy, many others within the foundation. And I guess they became more familiar with the work. We also gave them some updates. And then we were doing some work at Ashoka as well, where the Gates Foundation has been a key partner, particularly the Center for Social and Behavior Change, which has been a cutting-edge center in that space. So there were multiple points of interaction, and I think that led to some getting to know each other. And, for whatever reason, they possibly wanted someone from this part of the world represented on their board. And so I don't know why, but I got the call one day. It wasn't a process. I just got the call
from
one day from both Melinda and Bill jointly. It was a quick sort of, I actually had some folks over for dinner that night, but I was told I was going to be called. So I told these people I didn't know what it was for. But it was a fairly brief 20-30 minute call, just inviting me to join. And of course I said yes right away. I don't think I had to think about it. And I was very excited at the prospect because it's a relatively new board. The Gates Foundation, historically, it was Bill and Melinda and Warren Buffett. And then and later they transitioned now to, obviously the two of them are there, the CEO, and 6 people who are independent, who are on the board.
Yeah. No, I see it as a very, very important milestone, and I'm sure it will kind of shape things even in India in the coming years in this philanthropy space. Great. Let me touch upon the second thing that has happened over the last year or a little more than that, which is something that you are driving front and center, which is the Convergence Foundation, right? And that again to me is a interesting concept, a fascinating concept, because you were running Central Square Foundation. You spent 10 years kind of doing that, and then you said, okay, let me kind of zoom out. Central Square Foundation is one, Ashoka is another, but let us have organizations in different domains: economic development, gender, air quality, and so on and so forth, sports. And the Convergence Foundation would incubate or basically seed grant them, handhold them as they create impact in their respective journeys. Right? This is almost, if I had to take a parallel again to the corporate world, then it's like, let's say the Tatas are running Tata Steel, and one day they say, okay, let's become Tata Sons, and let's have a TCS, let's have there are different companies working in different domains. Of course, this is different. You're not, there's no equity here. It's not for profit. You're kind of giving grants for your hand-holding. But what was the thought process? Was it something that you always thought that you'll do it in one domain and then you'll kind of zoom out and work across domains? So it's something that came to your mind as you were going along. Tell me the thought process behind TCF.
Honestly, Gaurav, my initial foray outside of the corporate world was all in education. Ashoka, Central Square Foundation. My passion was really around education. It is later that, after completing a few years, both of these were, I wouldn't say they're still in the process of getting built, but the ship had been steadied, that I started to think beyond. And partly, I think it was a friend of mine, Sri Rajan, who's on our board at Central Square Foundation.
Bain.
The person who led Bain in India earlier. So Sri and I were just chit-chatting, and Sri said, what do you really enjoy doing? What would you really want to do the next 15, 20 years? And I said, Sri, I really have been an entrepreneur at heart. I like this. I like reading a lot. I like synthesizing. I like supporting people who are building something. And I don't mind playing a little bit of a backseat role. I don't have to, like with Central Square Foundation, I was more the driver.
Yeah.
And then eventually Shavita took over as the CEO. But that will then give me the ability to support many initiatives. It also was at a point in time when, initially pre-leaving the corporate world, all my philanthropy was, my wife and I, was very small check, very dispersed, multiple organizations, other than 1 or 2 somewhat larger donations. After leaving my corporate career, it was very concentrated in just these 2 initiatives. I mean, small things here and there outside, but really these 2. So I then also started to think from a philanthropic perspective, how do we look at it a little bit, a broader initiative? And what excites me is this idea of, building new institutions and supporting people who are building these institutions. I'm interested in India's economic development. I think we are amongst the best positioned in the world to grow in a rapid and sustained manner over the next 30 years. And both of us are at a stage in our lives where hopefully we can live to see that.
Yeah.
And so I think the big actors are the government and the markets, business. As someone on the outside, I think even if we can play some small role in building institutions that can support these two main actors in that journey, I thought it would be very fulfilling.
Yeah.
So that's where the thought sort of germinated, and it started very ad hoc. Initially we had this idea that we should create like a leadership program for the social sector at Central Square Foundation. And then Anu Prasad, who was the Dean of the Young India Fellowship at Ashoka, she'd moved and done something else for 6 months. She was frustrated. I requested to meet her, we met, and I said, Anu, this is a new idea, and she jumped on it. And then we supported Anu to create ILSS, which is a new thing about 5 years ago.
Indian leaders to social sector, we help people make transition from the corporate world to the social sector.
And then many others got started. And then really it's only in the last year and a half, 2 years, that we've created the Convergence Foundation. Earlier it was very ad hoc, but now a little bit more thinking around what do we want to do in terms of whether it's supporting India's economic development, whether it's building institutions, whether it's having a more strategic approach to philanthropy. Those are really the big things that we want to work on.
No, it's very, very interesting. I'll just pick on a couple of things that you said, Ashish, and you say that India is best positioned to kind of have sustained economic development in the coming years. Why do you believe so? What are the factors that...
So sustained and rapid. Those are two key words. Because I think if you can grow at 7-8% in a consistent manner over 30 years, the compounding effects, right?
Yeah.
But if on the other hand, you grow for short periods of time and then there's volatility, then you end up like Argentina or many other countries we've seen in the emerging world. In Africa, it's really political and instability, violence that mars long-term accelerated economic growth. So I think India is well positioned for several reasons. One is, I think we have a government that is very much pro-development in two ways. One is development for the bottom half, which is really providing all the basic services, whether it's electricity, water, sanitation. And I think we've done a great job in terms of learning as a system how to put things into mission mode, use whether it's IT tools, etc., to track and to deliver without spending huge amounts of money. Right? Within our normal fiscal constraint, we've gotten a lot done in terms of delivering more for the bottom half. So that's sort of welfareism on steroids, as it were. At the same time, I think somewhere we've also realized that, and it started in 1991, but I think for this government, particularly I feel in the last 2 years, a realization that economic growth is critical, that we need to be pro-business, we need industrial policy like East Asia had, and we need to support business and create national champions. We need to support our SME sector. And this is what will power us for the next 30 years. We need to support the startup ecosystem. And so I feel that we have a pro-business government as well, and a government that really understands the levers of economic growth. And I don't think this will change. Different state governments have different political hues, but you see Tamil Nadu has the aspiration to be $1 trillion economy, so does UP, so does Gujarat, so does Maharashtra, regardless of which political party. So I think somewhere I feel something has changed where we've become much more ambitious about our economic ambition and much more sharply focused on what are the levers to sort of get there. Combined with that ambition of both welfareism, economic growth, which makes it inclusive economic growth, is the fact that we have macroeconomic stability. India is one of the few countries that's never defaulted on her sovereign paper, since independence. That can't be said about most of the emerging world. You see what's happening in Sri Lanka and Pakistan, just in our own neighborhood, right? So that macroeconomic stability is very important if you want sustained long-term growth. And then finally, I think if you look at the talent pool, India has fantastic talent pool, both at the elite level and also at the mass level, and then capital now being mobilized in different forms. Foreigners want to invest here. We have this unique moment of the China +1 from an export standpoint. So there's so many, we could talk more about it, but I think there's so many interesting things that will almost ensure that we can grow in a China-like fashion over the next 3 decades. But hopefully do better than China. I mean, I say China-like, I mean in terms of the growth numbers, but I think we will have our own development model.
No, I'm completely with you on that, and extremely optimistic of what lies ahead. But at the Convergence Foundation, you're not just focusing on economic growth. You have all kinds of organizations working on different kind of issues, from dyslexia to gender to so. Why again make it broad-based and not focus on economic development?
So we break economic growth up into 2 tracks. And this was conceptualized by many people, not even Arvind Panagar has written extensively about this when he was leading NITI or even afterwards. I think track 1 is more the engine of economic development, right? Which is like we have initiatives that we've started around science and tech, policy advocacy, capacity building, or FED that works on labor-intensive sector, exports, manufacturing. That is more track 1. It's direct. It could even be you could put women's economic empowerment right there. Right? It's direct. There are other things that are sort of long gestation, but also linked to economic growth. I mean, education is one of those that really has it may take 15, 20 years, but it is the solid base. I mean, no country has truly developed unless you're just resource rich and you get lucky, right? Truly developed without a solid education system, because otherwise you're not creating opportunities for all. It is only opportunities for the top quarter or the top half. So I think really everything falls into one of these 2 buckets in a sense. And what we want is economic growth that is inclusive. And I think the second pillar helps make sure that growth is inclusive as well. So many of the initiatives are focused on that part that makes sure it's inclusive.
Got it. And what do you really look for in the organizations that you are kind of getting in the TCF for? What's the criteria? What's the eligibility, and then what's the selection criteria?
So I think one very important factor is that people should think a little bit more like foundations as opposed to an NGO. I think India already has...
What's the difference?
So I'll tell you. India already has lots of non-profits. We don't know the exact number. Some people say 2-3 million, whatever it is. It's a very large number of NGOs. So I think there's a lot of entrepreneurial energy there. I feel one of the missing links is we don't have as many players who work, and then we have a lot of think tanks as well. We don't have orgs that are downstream from the think tanks, but upstream from the NGOs, right? Where, say a new organization we set up called Udeti that works on women's economic empowerment. You think about the issue more holistically. I think an NGO would just focus on one slice and become very programmatic and start doing work. You think about it holistically in terms of what are the data gaps, what is the additional research that needs to be done, what are the policies, and what can change in terms of policies, what are some good policies in states in India that can be taken elsewhere. If you look at gender budgeting, what is being done today, what could be done differently. So there's that aspect of it. What are the enabling conditions? We know with women's economic empowerment, it's safety, security, mobility are key enabling conditions, right? And what could be done on that front? We know that demand is an issue. Whether it's changing some of the labor laws to make the workplace better for women, night shift, all of that, whether it's certain flexibility at the workplace, or even certain types of jobs that are more women-friendly, or whether it's holding large corporates accountable. So there's all these different levers. So I think we want people who think a little bit more systemically.
More systemically, more strategically, holistically, as opposed to a part of the puzzle looking at one puzzle.
As opposed to getting wedded to one approach, right? Because sometimes that becomes very narrow. You are willing to test out and work with partners. And also be more of an ecosystem player. You can work with multiple partners, be a little bit more holistic, be a little bit more strategic. And the reason to do that is because there aren't too many organizations or institutions doing that in India. It also allows you to partner with more institutions. Otherwise, as you know, in non-profit world, if I have a program and you have a program, then it gets a little competitive. In this mode, it's less competitive.
Yeah. And you said two main actors are the government and the markets, right?
Yes.
And it's important to engage with the both, work with both. But one of the observations, at least I have had over the last decade, is that not everyone outside of the government is good in engaging with the government or are effective in engaging with the government. And that's not a common kind of skill in that sense. You are somebody who has done that really well through the CSF work and through now the TCF. What have been your learnings? How do you engage effectively with the government as a entity which is outside working in the impact space?
Yeah. I think firstly, we have to recognize that government is the big actor in this space. I mean, in education, government spends this year, almost 7 lakh crore on education. So whatever philanthropy NGO spend is a drop in the bucket, right? I think philanthropy has a role, which is, it can do a lot of innovation, new things. We've seen NGOs in India come up with new models of showing how literacy numeracy can be solved. It can build evidence. You can pay for the evidence building. You can come up with interesting, working with government on policy solutions based on the evidence, and then support government with policy implementation. But really, to work with government, I think more than me, I think it's really the people who lead these organizations. We want to find people who have that partnership mentality, who recognize government is a big actor and are willing to, work in a manner that is conducive to working with government, which I think involves a few things. Firstly, that you recognize that government is a big actor.
Yeah.
2 is that you take no credit. I mean, really, it is government who is the big actor. They are the ones driving it, and you're playing a backroom, backseat role, a support role in the equation. 3rd is, even if one finds gaps, which there often are in implementation, it is to be shared with the key actors. It is not to be taken outside. Our job is never to criticize government. Because somebody else can do that.
You're not media.
I think in our role, it is a positive role because we are working with change agents who actually want things to improve. So as opposed to writing op-eds about what isn't working, our focus instead is on having an honest discussion with people, saying, look, here are the improvement areas, and here's what we can do to work with you, or here's what a partner can do to work with you. And I think that makes it a very positive, because honestly, I feel people in government want to bring about change. And if someone from outside is only going to be criticizing them, then you can't be their partner also. If you're going to be their partner, then act like a partner. But act more like a silent partner, because you are the silent partner, they are the big actor.
So the other extreme also is something that's sometimes observed, right? You get too subservient. So this is one extreme that you're talking about. The other extreme is that you're not speaking up enough, you're not kind of sharing evidence, sharing data. You kind of become almost a yes man to what's happening, and that's something again that's detrimental to the overall outcome. So have you seen that also, and how does one not do that? Because that's can tend to be the normal tendency.
Yeah, and of course, I think for many of our organizations that work with government, you have to respond to the needs of government. You have to be willing to do certain things that you may deem to be menial, right? But it's part of the game. I think I apply like a 80-20 rule at the end of the day. At the end of the day, if you can still keep 80% of the energy, that's what I tell people, focused on what are the important priorities and pushing the ball forward, 20% one will always have to be reactive to what's happening. Maybe early on in the relationship, it's more 60-40, and you have to earn the trust to move it to 80-20. I have personally found that if the concerned actor feels that you're providing a good supporting role, they even ask for new ideas. Yes. You have the chance to even share, as opposed to just doing implementation, ideas around what could make it better. And most state governments, most people are actually very receptive because they're in the mode of actually showing results.
No, I completely am with you when it comes to working with the government. I remember when we were starting 10 years back, we had made a conscious choice that all the work that we'll do, we will be with the system, will be with the government. It was coming from the fact that the core belief is that if needle has to move for the country, everything that you do has to be at scale. The impact has to be at scale. And if scale is an imperative, then government becomes an imperative, because government has the maximum reach, government has the mandate, government has the resources, as you're saying, and you cannot wish away the governance process. You have to kind of engage with the government and make things happen. The good part is at the time while the narrative was not this, a lot of NGOs that you're saying were very happy doing their own thing in a smaller scale, really having deep impact, but not really engaging as much with the government. But if you talk about today and where you go, I think sir now accepted this thing that it's critical to kind of work with the government to really move.
Absolutely. And Gaurav, apart from scale, it's also sustainability.
Yeah.
No NGO can sustain anything. If something has to be sustained, it has to be embedded in the system, owned by the system, run by the system. So that is the only way to ensure sustainability also. And I think what Samagra has done, what some of the institutions we support are really doing differently than what was done earlier, I believe is that translational muscle. There are good solutions in India on the ground or in other places. It's really finding ways when government has the political will to do something, which it does in many areas, to be supportive by bringing these innovations, but figuring out how they will get embedded in a systemic manner.
Yeah. Cool, great. So let's now talk a little bit about Central Square Foundation. TCF is something we've been doing for 2 years now. Central Square Foundation, we've been kind of running, as you're saying, the driver's seat for almost a decade. Tell me about the initial, transition from Chris Capital, from the private equity world to the impact space, and that started with Central Square Foundation, full-time at least. What was the thought process then? Again, was it something that you had planned long back that you will kind of have a career in the corporate world and then make this transition? Or something happened, you felt this is the right time for you to kind of contribute here? How was the thought process, and how did that transition happen 10, 12 years back?
Yeah, so I had been thinking about the change for a long time. It was somewhere in my 20s when I was at business school.
Okay.
That I decided I wanted to be an entrepreneur at age 30, and I wanted a second career in my 40s.
Okay.
So that was always in the back of my head. I think in terms of specifically Central Square Foundation, that happened a little later. I mean, honestly, I got to know people like Madhav and Rukmini at Pratham. I got to meet many other people in the social sector, even while I was in my corporate career. And I think through that, I learned a little bit about what is going on in education. I had met people in government, to be honest. I had read certain reports and things that are put out by government, by the World Bank, etc. So that was my limited knowledge. Honestly, when we started, the idea from the beginning was we should work on system reform. We should focus on a few key areas. But I would say I was still quite naive because I was moving from the corporate world and I didn't understand the complexities. So the mistakes we made the first 6 years is we were too broad, trying to work on everything from early learning to the school to work transition. Too spread out, working with too many state governments on point solutions, often reactive. So Andhra Pradesh would say, we want to try out something in EdTech, we'll go and help them with the procurement, the process and what's happening, but honestly not staying long enough.
Yeah.
And my lesson learned was none of these things were adding up because too many point solutions, too spread out, not sustained long enough, and not strategic enough. So when we took stock, we said, honestly, if we want to make a difference, we have to narrow the focus. And let's focus on what is most important for the country. And the data was very clear to everybody that foundational literacy and numeracy, what we all call FLN, was the key priority area in the system. So we said, if we start here, everything from building the surround sound around this issue, getting everybody in the ecosystem, whether it's talk to the political class, to bureaucrats, to...
This double click for me on that bit, because I think we'll come to the other aspect, but building this surround sound, getting everyone to kind of make it an agenda for everyone, that's not easy. And you're saying you spoke to a lot of people. So what was the thinking behind it? Who are the set of people who came together to do this? And also if you could share some examples, some anecdotes of some of these conversations, because they're not It's not something that is easy, advocacy at that level.
Yeah. So I would say the idea really came from initially when we found that there were several NGOs working in foundational literacy and numeracy. Pratham, LLF, Room to Read, many of them. So we set up like a mini consortium almost, where we would do like a meeting once a quarter to like a collective, right? And I think everybody was saying this needs to become a broader narrative issue. We, being a foundation, said, look, fine, we'll invest behind it, but we want all your voices also to come together on this. And fortunately, I think for us, if we went and spoke to anybody, say, minister, I remember I met Jay Panda when he had switched over to the BJP, and we met him at his house, and he instinctively got it. He said, this is so obvious that if learning is breaking down early, we ought to work. We had met with Jyotiraditya Scindia, he'd also switched BJP, and all these ministers are super smart. And so he looked at the data and said, look, it's very clear that this is something that needs to be prioritized. Or even when the committee that was drafting the NEP, of course, there were many people who were providing inputs. I think it was clear to them also very quickly that for FLN is something that we need to prioritize. If more than half the children are falling behind, in primary school itself, there's no opportunity for them to catch up later. So there are many of these meetings with whether it's politicians, bureaucrats. I remember going to meet even in Madhya Pradesh, Rashmi ma'am was even today there. And she immediately said, it makes sense, Madhya Pradesh needs to prioritize this. And ultimately the CM put into mission mode and made it Mission Ankur. So there were so many of these conversations where honestly we weren't saying anything new. I think people already instinctively, ये बुनियादी शिक्षा है, इसके बिना आगे नहीं जा सकते. But थोड़ा सा, to say अब इसको mission mode में डालिए, इसके tools हैं,
ये हो सकता है,
थोड़ा structured way में हो सकता है, and here are the pillars to make it happen. I think a little bit of the how give people the confidence that this can be done. And so I think fortunately it's not just CSF. I think it's really Samagra has worked on this. So many actors coming together that help build the surround sound, and including the people from within the system themselves who believed in it, that ultimately it led to a climax where the Prime Minister himself announced a national mission focused on this area called NIPUN Bharat. And I think we're all privileged that, we get to work in this area where there is now much greater political will to support this initiative.
I think one of the hypotheses I had on the education front, education never became a political agenda. It's still not, other than let's in Delhi. It's a mission nationally, it's not a political agenda. And you're not contesting elections on that. And one of the reasons, and it's a hypothesis, and I want to get your thoughts on it, is that the confidence that it can be delivered is not very high in the system. It's not that it touches everyone. Every family will kind of get affected by education. But if the political class really believe that it is deliverable, it can be delivered, then maybe it gets picked up. I don't know. What's your reading of it not being a political agenda, at least yet?
No, I agree with what you're saying. I think ये है कि that with building, taking electricity or piped water or toilets and sanitation to the home, I think that people understand कि भाई जो physical infrastructure है वो 5 साल में हो सकता है. You do the planning for a year, you make the budgets available, it takes a year or so to ramp up, and then you can really be all out. And so 5 साल में you can make it.
और government के हाथ में भी थोड़ा directly है, they can push it, they can do it.
तो वो those I think are the government is delivered. Fantastic. I think everybody understands that education, health are much harder. Some areas of health where a vaccine can just solve everything, like India has done a remarkable job with polio or eradicating, certain diseases. But when it comes to education, it's a very complex production function. एंड वो टीचर के हाथ में है अल्टीमेटली. आप जितने भी डेटा सिस्टम बनाएंगे, वो सिल्वर बुलेट एज इट वर, जैसे वैक्सीन तो एक सिल्वर बुलेट है. सो यहाँ पे बिकॉज इट्स कॉम्प्लिकेटेड, आई थिंक पीपल को इतना कॉन्फिडेंस नहीं है. प्लस द फीलिंग इज कि थोड़ा इंटेंजिबल है. पेरेंट्स को पता भी चलेगा नहीं कि कुछ हुआ है नहीं हुआ.
ग्रेटिफिकेशन इज डिलेड. 15 साल बाद इसका शायद फायदा
बाद में पता, एटलीस्ट अर्ली इयर्स में पता चलेगा. एंड विल इट बी डिलीवर्ड विद इन 5 years or not, you know, the outcome. So I think that the good news is actually it can be. I mean, because you see, particularly early years में जब बच्चा थोड़ा सा पढ़ने लगता है, I think parents को immediately पता चल जाता है. या बच्चा can do simple गणित, you know, adding 2 numbers, subtracting, वो तो parent को भी समझ आ जाता है. So writing, you know, it's very visible. So I think actually these things are very visible. And parents को बहुत जल्दी से समझ आ जाता है. And these things also can be picked up quite fast. I mean, if you look in India, things like even letter recognition, about 25-30% of children by class 1 can't recognize letter. अब this is a shame. No reason why अक्षर को बच्चा recognize नहीं कर सकता है. तो ये तो इसको इरेडिकेट करना है. उसके अगर आप आगे जाएं तो डिकोडिंग है, जैसे साउंड्स को ब्लेंड करना. अब यहाँ पे ब्रेक डाउन है, उसको हम इरेडिकेट कर सकते हैं. फिर slowly we can get to reading, at least reading fluency and then reading with comprehension. So I feel the steps are there and each step is visible in a fairly short period of time. So there are some lead indicators where, you know, parent को पता चलना चाहिए कि थोड़ी बच्चे की vocabulary बढ़ गई है, confidently बात कर रहा है, रीडिंग में थोड़ा एटलीस्ट अक्षर लेवल पे कुछ समझ आ रहा है, decoding of words या blending of sounds. So I think these baby steps are visible even within 1 to 2 years. And actually within 3 to 4 years, reading भी, you know, you can take to scale. So I think this focus in one area, not saying हम पूरे education को पूरा system को reform करें, वो बहुत मुश्किल है. But एक narrow area में दिखाएंगे कि ये जो बच्चों को पढ़ना और गणित करना क्लास 3 तक ये हम सिखा देंगे, आई थिंक ये फीजिबल है 4-5 साल.
तो आशीष, आपको कॉन्फिडेंस है कि निपुण भारत लॉन्च हो गया है, मेनी स्टेट्स हैव देयर ओन मिशंस, दे आर वर्किंग टुवर्ड्स इट. तो मतलब यू सी कि अगले 4-5 साल में देयर कैन बी अ वेरी टैंजिबल डिफरेंस इन फाउंडेशनल लिटरेसी?
मेरे को लगता है, आई फील कॉन्फिडेंट दैट विल हैपन. I mean, we're working as partners in UP. You see it, what the UP government has done. I think it's phenomenal. जो पिछले 2 साल में हुआ है, I don't think it has happened before. But I see in many other states also. I mean, UP may be one of the most dynamic, but others are catching up now. And even non-BJP states में. I mean, you see in Tamil Nadu, the focus on, you see now in Telangana, the focus on this, in Odisha, of course in the BJP states, in Haryana, UP, many states, Madhya Pradesh, in Assam. I met the Chief Minister in Assam and, you know, it was a very good meeting. He listened very carefully, actually understood it immediately and even got into the details of saying what are the levers. आप बताइए teaching learning material में क्या बदलेगा, ये lesson plan क्यों important है teacher के लिए, ये formative assessment हर हफ्ते क्यों होना चाहिए, remediation क्यों. तो quite a bit of deep understanding. KPIs पे भी ये 3 KPI पहले क्यों important है. And then immediately said कि हम इनको अपने dashboard में should be included. So to in one meeting to go from saying I get why it's important, actually understanding the how, having the confidence to say yes, ये निपुण भारत जो है, निपुण अहम जो कहते हैं उसको, in Assam, we will go and deliver Nipun Aksam. In this period of time, हम CM के level पे इसको dashboard में ले आएंगे. I think it's phenomenal. ये पहले तो होता नहीं था. So I feel quite confident when you see not just at the bureaucratic level or even lower levels, but at the political level, there is this understanding and desire. It makes you feel that there's a real opportunity. And I feel working 10 plus years in education, this is the one chance we have. अगर हम अगले 4 साल पे नहीं कर पाए, then when will we make it happen?
Exactly. And once the taste of that comes, once it starts seeing results, then also it becomes, the political salience just keeps on increasing.
True.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Great. And moving on from Central Skill Foundation, let's talk a little bit about Ashoka. That's the other kind of piece that you've been associated with from the beginning. I think you started kind of working on that while you were still
Yes.
at Chris Capital. So tell me again, how did it start? How did some of you kind of think about the idea? How did you kind of, it's a big vision, right? You want to create a Ivy League equivalent in India, and that to a university in liberal arts, right? That's not common in India, at least was not common at all when you guys thought about Ashoka. So वो कैसे thought process कैसे शुरू हुआ? And how did it kind of...
Yeah, I think it was a group that came together. I mean, you know some of the people, Pramad Sinha, Sanjeev Bikhchandani, Vineet Gupta, many others. And then soon thereafter, more people joined even. Amit Chandra from Bombay and Sid Yog and many folks. R.K. Damani, Rakesh Jhunjhunwala, many people supported. So we were lucky that there were many people who wanted to support the institution. I think really what at the core was that we are following this very British model of education, higher education. And the British put this model in place for a purpose. Basic idea is to put students in a straitjacket. You know, after class 10, you narrow, and then college mein aapko ek hi subject padhna hai, and very linear, you know, blinders on. And so we said that, look, we're now living in the 21st century, and 21st century education is very different because now specific knowledge has value, of course, to go into depth. But if you're only trained in one area, you're not going to be able to perform in the 21st century. I think you get data from all kinds of sources, and in a way you have to look at whether you're in business to understand, have a historical perspective, to understand history. You have to understand some psychology to understand other people. And you have to understand some sociology and economics to understand society and the economics of that, what that works. You have to have a scientific bend of mind. You have to have some quantitative thinking, computational thinking as well in today's world. So I think today's world, in any job, requires you to be interdisciplinary. I think liberal arts in India, people often think is arts, humanities. I really think of it as being interdisciplinary. That's at the core of what we're trying to do. Interdisciplinary. That you have an exposure to all disciplines, and that you have an interest in multiple disciplines. You have the flexibility to choose. Ki aapne jaise, I don't know how students decide when they're in school that law exam likhna hai aur hum law padhenge. Because you've never been exposed to law in 9th through 12th.
You've seen some movies probably.
Yeah, medicine. Aapko kaise pata hai? So I think here you have the choice ki after you come in, you know, you decide that, okay, maybe I'm interested in computer science and economics, or computer science and philosophy, and I'll do both together. Interdisciplinary program. So I think interdisciplinarity is, to me, and choice are two very important things. Giving students choice, allowing them to mix and match. Interdisciplinarity in that you have this breadth plus depth. This is at the heart of a 21st century education, because 21st century education means you should be able to deal with information coming, lots of ambiguous data. You should be able to connect the dots. You should be able to think broadly if you want to be a leader. You have to be able to carry people along with you, you know, be a team player. You have to have a social conscience. Think about the country, think about the world at large. So often if you are just trained in one discipline, you may not have that social conscience, that awareness, or have that global perspective. So we felt this education very important, and that we can play a pioneering role in bringing this new form, breaking the shackles of British education and bringing a new form of education to higher ed in India. And idea was to create one institution that becomes a role model then for others. Fortunately for us, the NEP, which is such a path-breaking document, NEP 2020, calls out now that all of Indian higher education needs to move in the direction of being interdisciplinary, holistic. And so I think it's fantastic now that in the next 20 years, by 2040, all of Indian higher education will move in this direction. So we didn't know that when we first created Ashoka, but that was always the desire. So that's one aspect. And the second aspect was more around this idea of research. You know, I think already our IITs, Indian Institute of Science, are research institutions, but there aren't too many research institutions, and particularly in areas like humanities, social science, you know, research has been ignored. So there was a real opportunity to build a leading research institution, doing cutting edge work, and hopefully research that also has an impact on society at large. So say take the Center for Social Behavior Change. The work that they do eventually feeds into the work that India is doing in public health, in anemia, in nutrition, and bringing a behavior science approach to it.
Yeah.
So I think that research and impact are two other things, because we think, as I mentioned earlier, next 3 decades are India's decades, and any new institution should be looking at doing research that's relevant and hopefully one that also has impact. So apart from the teaching being different, the pedagogy being different, I think this idea of research and impact also is something very exciting.
If you talk about from an institution building perspective, I think it's come around as a great institution, and it's already created a huge name for itself. You've been the chairperson also for the longest time of Ashoka. What are 2-3 things that you got right as a group, which has really helped in getting it as a solid institution which can kind of stand the test of times? What did you get right?
So I think firstly it is that to realize that the best institutions in the world in higher education are all non-profit. They are either, and by the way, many of them are private. So Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, or if you look at the US, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Chicago, all are private. There are many good government ones too, closer to home, NUS, or even some of the Chinese ones now, Tsinghua, Beda, University of Melbourne, etc. So, but they're all non-profit, because unless you have a non-profit, you can't prioritize research. Frankly, if you're for-profit, the best academics don't want to work with you. So you don't have this long-term thinking of investing, really, if you're for-profit. So first is you have to be non-profit. Second is that you have to focus on quality from day one. Unlike a company that can be very scrappy. I remember when I was a kid, there was a company called Lucky Gold Star. It made, I thought, terrible products compared to what the Japanese made. And ultimately, Lucky Gold Star became LG. And today beats the Japanese at what they do. In education, that's not the way it works. I think, the reason St. Stephen's still exists 135 or whatever years later and is a premier brand, or IITs was set up 50, 60 years ago, they're still premier brands, because they were excellent from day one. Or even IIM, when they were set up, the best students went there, the best faculty went there, and then it's a positive upward spiral. So you have to focus on getting the best faculty from the best places in the world, from day one. You have to focus on getting the best students. So if it means taking fewer students, that's okay. But they have to be really good students. Because the truth is, if you take, a middling student from a school in the first year, then the top students in the second year say, "Yaar, main yahan pe kahan jaunga?" It's all the middling students who aspire to come to you. You're stuck then.
Yes.
And
it's very difficult to come out of that cycle.
It's etched into the minds of all stakeholders, principals, counselors, parents, students. And faculty ke man mein bhi hota hai ki ab main ye kahan hua, am I stuck teaching mediocre students? So focus on quality from day one.
Being a not-for-profit,
ISB did that very well. You mentioned Rajat Gupta. ISB did that very, very well from day one. And I think that's why ISB has done so well. And I think a third one is to get the governance model, which is different, because you're private, non-profit. I think the idea that we're not family owned, the best institution in the world, again, if you look, all the top 200, Harvard may have John Harvard's name, but there's no member of the family involved. It's really the alumni who are trustees of the institution. So I think to have a model where day one, where the powers are distributed, you have multiple trustees on the governing body, board of trustees, etc., in the structures, and that all of them commit that the kith and kin will not be involved, family members, that ultimately will transition to alumni who will be caretakers of the institution, and that academics really focus more on the academic work, right? And so it's a shared governance model. we don't interfere with the core academic work. We don't tell a
Professor to kind of
and at the same time, we also have the policies, what are the new programs, the budgets, or our purview of the trustees for sure. So I think that shared governance model, and a governance model where continuously refreshes itself by bringing in alumni who come, is a new. ISP again, I think, did it and was a pioneer in the Indian context.
And in the governance model, how important was this collective philanthropy by typically first generation entrepreneurs? That's the typical profile of a founder or a trustee at Ashoka. So
I think that Ashoka was different from ISB. ISB was captains of industry. Ashoka was a lot of first gen. So, Sanjeev and I put in the first money initially to buy the land, but we were very clear from day one when we had the discussion that we will ensure, regardless of who puts in money, when they put in money, early, later, that the max one can have is one board seat, right? So that is a very important rule. I remember early on, we had a very wealthy industrialist there was a 3-page story on Ashoka in the Sunday Economic Times. This person was in Delhi and called, and I was actually abroad, and said, I'd like to meet. And I said, look, I'm traveling, but we'll get our team to come meet you and a couple of our trustees also. I met the person that day itself, was keen on, possibly making a contribution, but wanted 3 board seats. And we said, no, this will always be a shared governance in terms of, no one has the power is distributed disproportionate. And even if you later rate 1,000 crore check, you still have that one board seat. So nobody controls the institution in that sense. And it ensures that you have that transition ultimately then to alumni going forward. So I think it's very important. That principle is very important. Having first generation is very important because it's less, let me say, formal. I think when you have captains of industry, there's a little bit of formality in board meeting here. Here you have people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and say,
people who have been entrepreneurs, basically.
हमें ये करना है, हम यहाँ पे support करेंगे, we'll help make this part happen. Like, Amit Chandra said, let's set up a center for social impact and philanthropy. He basically led it, actually put money, made it happen. Ashok Trivedi said, I'm very passionate about bioscience. He put in quite a bit of money. It's a named Trivedi Bioscience School. He puts in so much effort to help recruit people. He helped create the Scientific Advisory Board, which includes Venki, who's a Nobel Prize winner. So I think it brings in many people who have a shared interest in building the institution, who bring their energy to the table, as opposed to just 2 or 3 or 4 people. So, I would say it's that shared energy that makes it really successful.
So essentially you're saying being a not-for-profit, excellence from day one, and thought through governance structure, and those are the 3 things. Anything that you would do differently, if you were to look back the last 10, 15 years, Ashoka journey, in hindsight, one is always wiser. Anything that you feel you could do differently, which would kind of, we could have helped even more?
Yeah, I think we could have possibly started with the sciences, computer science, all that. I mean, we did start maybe from day one itself. I think the idea was always to be a rounded institution. It's not that science, computer science will dominate humanities, social science. It's
coexistence.
Yeah, so it feels like earlier we only did humanities, social science. Now we're spending too much effort on science. But now it's really to balance out. But we could have possibly done more of it there. We could have paced ourselves a little bit in terms of the master's programs. I think we have a strong undergraduate program, maybe doubling down on that. We could build a stronger PhD program, which we will going forward. So yeah, I think there are some things, we should have bought more land at the outset. I think, sometimes you're entrepreneurial, you think ki Sarkar was allotting Haryana state government 25 acres. That's what we took. Frankly, we should have insisted at that point no less than 100 acres. Eventually now we have acquired more land.
It's been an effort, it's been a...
But, with hindsight from day one, we should have done that. So yeah, there's several other little things that could have been done differently. But I think the idea really is to focus on research and teaching and just as an institution, keep your head down and make that happen over the next 10, 20 years.
And if you look at, let's say, India at 100, if you look at that milestone, where would you want Ashoka to be by then? What would give all of you, in particular you, satisfaction to see Ashoka at where?
Yeah. I think firstly, a leading institution that serves the country, both in terms of research and teaching, and a pioneer with this interdisciplinary model. What will make me most happy is not so much one Ashoka that strives for excellence, which it should, but I think that there are 1,000 flowers that have bloomed, that many of our existing even IITs which are very good institutions, up the game from a research standpoint, that they also become more interdisciplinary, because they started more as pure technical, but they become more interdisciplinary as institutions, more holistic with the education, etc. I think that would be the ultimate India at 100, which is in the NEP, which is really we should have more of these well-rounded, large, there should be 20 Indian institutions in the top 200 in India at 100, but more than the top 20, there should be 200 institutions in the top 1,000. So this depth, because we will be the largest higher education system in the world. We already have, 40 plus million students in college. It will touch 50 million by the end of this decade. So it's a very large, complex higher ed system. And we have really smart people. There is no reason why we can't strive to be amongst the best in the world. We're not a backwater.
So Ashish, we've talked about the different things that you're focused on in the impact space now. We've talked about the Gates Foundation, we talked about the Convergence Foundation, Central Square Foundation, and the work at Ashoka. Since I have you with me, I want to use the opportunity to I know you read a lot, as you said, you think strategically, you've dabbled in so many different things, have done well in all of them. So at a macro level, let me pick a few areas. What are the 3 things India should do in, let's say, school education? What would your top 3 things be?
So for me, I think the top would be FLN by far. I think number 2 would be FLN and number 3 would be FLN. I think at this stage, it's like location. I think it's the next 5 years, if you ask me. I think just sharp focus and the momentum that we have behind NIPUN Bharat, the NEP, we have to achieve learning. This is the most critical. To have half our children almost be left behind, we have to lift the bottom half, basically. And this will then be permanent. These children will have better life outcomes, but it's not only them, but the next, the ones that flow through, the next cohort that comes in and the following, etc. So to me, that's the most important.
So foundation literacy and numeracy in school education. Second, what about higher education? What is it that our 3 things India should do or focus on higher education?
Yeah. So I think one is the implementation of this National Research Foundation that was talked about in NEP as an independent sort of body, a research foundation, reporting into the Prime Minister effectively. I think we need to prioritize research. We also need a governance model for research where we need to be more bold and ambitious in supporting our higher education institutions so that they can move up from a research standpoint.
Share a little more about the NRF, the National Research Foundation.
So idea of the NRF was to create a body that would, basically fund research across institutions in India with a governance structure which is mostly comprised of leading researchers from the domain and with some areas that the government would prioritize. So I think that's the idea. If we have to catch up, for instance, in AI, government's just announced the quantum mission, but one body that has the right mechanism to allocate, to monitor, to sometimes make sure that their national hubs set up. The government is doing some of that, but it becomes the way the US has a NSF and NIH, China has its own National Science Research Foundation. India needs a big one to make that happen.
So that's first, research.
The first one, research. I think a second one is particularly for the leading institutions. I think this focus on interdisciplinarity, which NEP talks about, moving towards, so at all the institutions, offering more choice, creating more interdisciplinary programs. It's not just about learning economics and learning public policy. I think it's economics and public policy. It's about learning computer science and entrepreneurship together, interdisciplinary programs, wedded together, like history and economics,
Not like the way when I used to study at IIT, we could take 3 humanities courses.
That would take that much more interdisciplinary, intertwined education. I think that's better for the 21st century. And the third, I would say, is for the mass, is really higher standards. So we need to define higher standards in all the professional educations, in engineering, in law, in management, in nursing, all these, really lift the standards, whether it's the accreditation framework, all of that, so that we have most of these are private, low performing, and we really need to lift the bar, the information asymmetry that exists, close that, and make sure that we get much better outcomes.
And that what you're saying primarily happens through accreditation. You define standards and then everybody competes to kind of or strives to get to those standards.
And also for the students and parents to also know which are the A, B, C, D institutions, so that market forces can correct for themselves much faster. A little bit of it has happened in engineering, where the worst institutes have had to shut down as there was overcapacity. But I think the market signals could have happened much faster. And in many of these areas, we still keep reading about that 70% of our engineering graduates are not ready, it's at job ready. I think we have to lift that, the standard, so that, that 70% becomes 20%. I'm not saying it'll go to zero, but it goes down to 20-30%.
So research, interdisciplinary education across all the higher education institutes, and standards that lift the general kind of bar.
And especially, I would say, starting in the professional courses, so that people going to jobs in these courses are fit for employment in those sectors. And honestly, the standards should, to some extent, in those even be informed by industry to some extent, like law, management, nursing, all of them, pharmacy.
So we've talked about school education, higher education. Third is economic development. Well, that's the current focus area that you have. So 3 things to kind of really press the pedal on economic development.
So I think one big opportunity for India is exports. We are a very large country, 17% of the world's population, but 2% of the world's exports for manufactured goods. China is dominant. All of East Asia grew because of accelerated exports over a long period of time. And that's why they were able to grow at 8-10%. You can grow at 5-6% with your normal domestic growth. But if you want that accelerated growth, you need the extra fillip, because the world market is so much larger than your own market.
Even you feel that's also true for India, given.
See, we'll always say India is a very large economy, but we are still a $3.5 trillion economy in a $100 trillion global economy. And in many sectors, that ratio is even smaller because we are more weighted towards basic goods. So I think the world market is much larger. So it's like with IT. If our IT companies were just to serve domestic India, imagine you wouldn't have even had an Infosys and ITC. You wouldn't have even heard of them. They would have been low-end firms that would have been anonymous. So I think the world market's very, but it also pushes you in terms of the quality standards of your products, and your productivity levels go up. So I think this is India's opportunity to go from 2% market share in the world to 5% by 2030. Eventually to 10% by 2040, much higher. Our
and you're not manufacturing export primarily.
That's manufacturing. And in services, I was coming to, equally, we have 5%. We're doing well in services, but we still punch below our weight, even in services. And services, India has been strong. 300+ billion of services export now in a roughly 5.5-6 trillion service export market. I think, again, there we should get to 10% plus more like 15%, in the end of this decade, and ultimately look to be the dominant player in service exports at 20-25% long term. So I think manufactured goods, ultimately we should get to 15%, and services we should ultimately get to 20%. Over a 25-year period of time. So that's one, and that will make us very competitive. It'll provide accelerated growth. Each direct job creates multiple indirect jobs. Within exports, even labor-intensive exports is where China wins today. Because of the geopolitical shift against China, I think we can win that away. In garments, in electronics, we're seeing it happen in front of eyes in electronics, in so many other areas. Shoes, I just read Tamil Nadu, the shoe companies are moving in now. Very labor intensive. It'll create lots of jobs. So that's one big area. A second, very important thing for us as we go forward is urbanization. We need to create cities. We need to invest more in our cities. The cities are vibrant places. Productivity levels are much higher. Even if you look at a lot of this manufacturing that's being attracted, they're on the outskirts of cities. Where's our big electronics cluster in northern India? It's not in the middle of some rural heartland. It's on the outskirts of Delhi, in Noida, Greater Noida, right? So where is the auto cluster? It's on the outskirts of Chennai or Pune. So I think having cities that are well organized, where we have great transport networks, where we really have created these mega cities. Like NCR in my mind is a mega city. I think India needs to create these mega cities that are highly productive, where we can pull in talent, and the services, manufacturing, because we need to transition away from agriculture. So a second key point is structural transformation, away from agriculture into manufacturing and services. It hasn't happened fast enough. It needs to happen much faster. And cities are the magnet for for structural transformation. So second one would be that. And women, of course, are more liberated in cities also, right? It's easier for them to get employment if we were to lower the barriers, particularly safety, mobility, if we can do that and provide the flexibility. So I would hope that we can see female labor force also go up dramatically in urban India. And then the third one is really about moving up the value chain. So whilst we do all of this, and we are doing this now, we have become more ambitious. We've got a vibrant startup economy, but they're not really in deep tech, but at least you have the startup energy. We have low R&D as a percent of GDP, 0.7%, but what's abysmally low is corporate R&D as a percent of GDP, which is like 0.25%. So all of corporate R&D in India is $10 billion. Less than one company, Google, or one company, Amazon, or one company, Samsung. So we need to really, in the next 20 years, corporate R&D needs to go up dramatically, right? And the large corporates in the US, large being defined as companies even above 25 million, spend about 6% of revenue on R&D. In China, that's now about 3% of revenue. In India, it's abysmally low. So I think we need a movement where we are moving up the value chain. We're investing in, not just being a assembly of electronics, but actually making the products that go behind. And eventually, then you can get into design and into having your own brands as well, right?
But and this part is important so that we continue to kind of grow.
Yeah. I think we'll still grow from 2,500 per capita to 5,000 with the basic. But if you want to punch eventually through 5,000-10,000 and go to the other side to 20,000 per capita income, you need to. And a country as large as India, because we have a large home market, if we can do it here, we can be a major force in these areas. I mean, that's the advantage China has, the US has, large home market. So I think we have a big opportunity here in moving up the value chain. It's like you've seen now the pharma companies have realized, in commodity generics, they played that game, they have market share in the US, they now need the next game, which is specialty generics, it's biosimilars, ultimately NCEs, new chemical entities, R&D. we have to move up the value chain. I mean, at some point we have to say there's a drug that's come out of India. You know, it'll happen. There's no reason why out of the R&D centers, you know, you look at semiconductor, the fabulous semiconductors. In some way, I think there are like 300-400 R&D centers in India doing work for the mothership elsewhere, but nothing that's in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So we have the ingredients, I think. It all has to come together through greater stimulation from government around R&D, the large corporates recognizing it's a matter of survival, the startup ecosystem moving from basic stuff to deeper tech work, the university system being able to support that from a research standpoint. So I think all of this needs to come together in the next decade or two so that India is not, we don't want to be a Thailand, right? As we grow, I think we want to be a South Korea or a China. You know, China has moved up the value chain. They now will have a plane of their own, which will compete with Boeing and Airbus. You know, they have aspirations to build a semiconductor industry. They've already done it with smartphones and electronics and many other areas, heavy machinery, trains. India has to do the same and do better.
So exports, urbanization, and moving up the value chain broadly. Great. This is very, very interesting. Ashish, I want to a little bit focus on your own kind of learnings, your own journey. You really kind of cut your teeth in the private equity world with Chris Capital. That's where you really learned. That's where you got with your name, you made the money. All of that happened there. And then you made this shift over the last 10 to 12 years. Almost equal amount of time, I would say, you spent in the private equity world, in the corporate world, and in the impact space now. What are some of the learnings that you had there, or some of the skills or some of the learning which you could apply as is to this space? And what are some of the things you almost had to unlearn, or new skills or the new kind of ways of working that you pick up here? I think that contrast would be interesting to understand.
Yeah. So firstly, I'm quite hopeful that I think people with corporate skills can come into the social sector, the development sector, the impact sector, let's put it this way. Because at the end of the day, a lot of it is about, you know, self-leadership, leading others, and then leading for impact, right? And those tools that you develop, whether it's in terms of recruiting people, managing them, performance management, or whether it's in terms of implementation, execution, toolkit, I think you have to do that here as well. So I'm very hopeful. You just need to understand the domain and take the time. And I think, frankly, corporate people should be excited because the problems here are more complex, more interesting, more impactful than in the corporate world. I think what one has to unlearn is, I think in the corporate world, there is a belief sometimes you can get things done very quickly. And you very rapidly come to, oh yeah, I figured it out. You know, I read this, and yeah, in education, ye karna hai. And a lot of it comes from personal experience also. I think that's a big danger here. Because, you know, here I think one needs to look at the evidence a little bit more carefully. It's not, these things have been tried before. One needs to be a little bit more dispassionate, I would say, and understand that it takes time, you know, to figure out even what to prioritize and what the design maybe to solve the problem. I think as corporate people want to jump and find the answer very quickly. वैसे होता नहीं है. Two is patience. I think, you know, we are used to in corporate world of quarterly results and quarterly metrics. Of course, you need some metrics here also, but I think you need to have patience because it takes much longer. These are more complex problems. And so I think getting rid of a little bit of that, you need the energy, but you need long-termism versus short-termism in this space. I think it's very important. Third is, I think, having the humility to work through many actors and with many actors. I think you're often in the driver's seat. You're building your own company, right? You do your own thing. When you're trying to support government or you're trying to support an ecosystem of partners who you're working with, or you're trying to support an industry body that works with markets, you know, that it's not easy to play that backseat role where you get less recognition. It's sometimes not easy when you're trying to get multiple players to work with together. So I think in the corporate world, you feel all the levers, or it's frustrating sometimes when things are going well for things outside your control, they fall back. Mostly in the corporate world, of course, policy can change even in the corporate world, but mostly the levers are in your control.
Yeah, externalities are less.
Yeah, the externalities are fewer. So I think just one needs a mindset that's more humility, more compassion, more understanding of the rhythm of the space, a little bit less focused on me, and more working with others, more collaborative, and long-term oriented.
Yeah.
Patience.
At least one thing that I have kind of felt that the challenges here are much more complex than the challenges in the corporate world. I've not spent that long a time in the corporate world. That's my kind of listening. Do you kind of concur with that?
I would agree.
You've got to kind of illustrate that with something. Why do you feel so, and why do you think it's the case?
So, I mean, let's take a typical corporate, even if it's TCS, right? A company today with 600,000 people, not easy to manage. But ultimately, it's got a hierarchy. Decision-making is very clear. And, if the bosses decide tomorrow we want to put lots of money behind a new geography or new service line or new way of working even, it can now, for that, even to implement that, you have to convince the next level and the level below. You'll do workshops, you'll create together, you'll then create plans, and then you get people embedded in KPIs, and it'll take you a couple of years to deliver to go make it happen in a large company like that. And particularly if you want to move that mothership in a slightly different direction, it may take longer now. I think imagine education. One state in India, in school education, a reasonable size state, would have as many employees as TCS, right? 600 plus thousand employees. Now imagine in that system to bring about change where it isn't the typical hierarchy. Each teacher works in a classroom by herself mostly. Most primary schools in India don't even have a headmaster, right? There are 2 or 3 teachers across 5 grades. In some states that are more densely populated, you might have 4 or 5 teachers.
There's no almost performance management.
There's no performance management system. It's a job for life that you have. It takes longer to make change. So every day when you wake up, if you do something differently, you don't immediately see the results. So it is much harder. And then political change could happen. Bureaucratic change happens every 2-3 years. Even at the BEO, DEO level, the block district level, there's a lot of churn. Sometimes post is vacant.
Vacancies. Huge amount.
So in that system, where the KPIs are sometimes not clear, where you have personnel management systems are not what they are in the corporate world, the hierarchies are not as well defined, the performance management is very, very different. It is a very different ballgame relative to the corporate world to drive change. And so I think the politicians and bureaucrats who make change happen are true heroes because, to do it, given all these constraints, is completely heroic. I mean, it's much more than what a corporate CEO does.
I completely agree with you. And in fact, I see often the challenge of governance is also a challenge of HR. Starting off, as you said, right, the vacancies, significant vacancies across any actually domain, any state you go to, there's massive vacancies. Then there is not enough kind of culture of training, mentoring, handholding, coaching, right, which is really the upskilling. That's kind of generally weak. And performance management, as we said, is more or less absent. Now, in this system, to perform makes it that much more complex and that much more difficult.
Yeah. But I think a good realization for us is that, we all tend to think of it sectorally, or even as secretary who's in education will tend to think of. But really, there's some systemic things which, if each state government would take seriously, which is around, defining the outcomes more clearly, getting the personal management, whether it's when you recruit people to defining the job roles clearly, being clear about, what tools they need to succeed, what training they need to have, how will their performance get measured, on a regular basis? How will they get regularized into their job?
Yeah.
All of that. Again, using TCS as an example that has 600,000 people, the investment they make in people, in HR, in performance management is incredible. And so in government, how does one make that happen? And then more strategic budgeting as well, within the system. And then regular monitoring with good data. So some of our schemes are doing it, but I think systemically, if this gets embedded in state governments, it'll lead to much better outcomes over time. Already some elements are happening, but I hope that as the Indian state improves, much like corporate India has improved, that we will get much better at this in the next decade.
Yeah. So I digressed a little bit, but I want to come back to you were talking about your learnings and how the transition to the impact space has been. At heart, Ashish, you've been an entrepreneur, right? At Chris Capital, you're an entrepreneur. CSF, you're an entrepreneur. Now also you continue to operate in that mode, and you've been kind of doing this for 25 years now. It takes a toll. It takes a toll as because you're always driven. You're always kind of at it. There are new problems that you're trying to solve. There are a lot of kind of. How has it been to kind of manage all of this with the personal life, right? You have a family, kind of kids, parents. How easy or difficult has it been, and how have you kind of navigated this aspect?
So, I don't mind working hard. I think it's what you sign up for. Like you are an entrepreneur, Gaurav, I think you sign up for it. But I think having some balance is really important. Firstly, whether it's time for yourself, working out or whatever time you need to reflect, those things are important. Whether it's time with spouse, kids, family. I'm not saying every weekend I'm switched off, but I make sure that mostly on weekends I have some downtime relative to during the week. I try best as possible to be back at a reasonable hour. So even if I have to work, I can work a little bit later into the night, but for a couple of hours I'm around. So as best as possible, and it ebbs and flows a bit. My last stint at Chris Capital, when I was winding down, I had a lot of free time. And then suddenly we started with some things. Then suddenly as CSF and all started, I had more time. But then I grabbed on to new things. So I think it's just, if something is important, you will make the time for it. So kids are super important. You have to make time. My dad always says, beyond a certain point, quality time is irrelevant, quantity matters. And I think he's right. Quantity does matter also.
That's this thing that we give ourselves, quality time.
And I'm a believer that, look, apart from the personal time to work out, stay fit, because that's very important, peace of mind.
What do you do for that? What do you do for...
I generally, most days of the week, in the morning, I work out. And a little bit of yoga, pranayam as well, and just generally keeps me good through the day. I don't play a sport right now, but I definitely do stay fit. I eat reasonably well, so in terms of nutrition, lifestyle also, making sure you go to bed at a reasonable hour, wake up early, those kinds of things just keep you at least hopefully younger than your chronological age. Your biological age should be lower, and energy is there. And then enough time for, I would say, obviously make sacrifices along the way. I wouldn't say it's been perfect. Whether it's points of time in life when you get too busy, you don't spend enough time with friends, or even enough time with family. But I think as long as one knows that that's super important. I had a boss at Goldman Sachs who once said to me that, listen, no success at work can compensate for failure at home. And that always stayed with me. So as long as you keep reminding yourself, look, we do tend to go into phases when, you probably forget a little bit, and then as long as you reflect and say, yeah, I need to spend more time, I need to do this, you make it happen. I also believe in taking enough time out for vacation. I think that's a good time to at least spend a chunk of time with family. And most of our vacations...
How frequent did you do that?
Quite often. At least we'll do a winter break and a summer break, at a minimum. And now I think thanks to COVID, discover India more. So even within India, go somewhere 3-4 days. It's nice time off, but it's also nice time together.
And how often do you kind of step back, reflect? One is ongoing, that you're constantly kind of thinking, but is there some structured step back reflection time that you kind of have for yourself?
Work or personal?
Both.
Work, though, I think happens because of the, other people are there, you're doing it together, it's not alone. Of course, alone also a bit because, that happens more like early in the morning, like when I wake up, I have time to think about, something and could it be done better or some new initiative. So that happens. I think it's a personal reflection time that I feel one has to be more disciplined about because there's so much to grab your attention in terms of information. It's easy even in the morning when I wake up to just get busy with email or reading some stuff I like reading and then not have, unless I carve out some time. So I find at least things like flights, I don't download movies, I don't, I used to carry a book, I don't even do that anymore. So those end up becoming times when there's real time for a little bit more reflection. But otherwise in the day-to-day, it doesn't happen.
And has this kind of balance that you're saying, has it changed from the increased capital days to CSF days to now when you're doing a portfolio of things? Or it's been kind of more or less similar?
I think it's relatively similar. I would say I pay more attention to my health, much more than I did earlier. I want to make sure I'm fit.
You get up early?
I get up early. Yeah, I get up early.
What time?
Today I was up at 4:30, 4:15.
Oh,
but it varies a bit. Like I would say, but yeah, in the 4:30 to 5:30 range, I'm up early. So going to bed late I'm devastated often the next day. I sometimes have to sleep in the afternoon if it's the weekend, if I go out late on a Friday night. But yeah, I think having a routine where up in the morning, I don't work out immediately. I typically read and get stuff done first 2 hours, then I work out from 7 to 8. Earlier, I would even do a meeting at like 7:30, 8 in the morning. I'm now very particular that I won't. I typically get to work by 9 or so I can leave home at 8:30. So I think having that...
so that is also your time, right?
Yeah.
Because that's where there's no...
Right. It's quite sacred now, and health. And thanks to my kids and my wife, I think even nutrition, I've improved dramatically. A little bit of mindfulness also, just being... So I think that part I do much better than I did earlier. Maybe I just took it for granted. I'm not sure I take care of myself.
Well, I think you are because you're saying 54 and that's hit me okay.
No, but you have to, I think at some point. We all grow older, so you have to make sure. And then even on the family side, it keeps evolving. Yeah? My kids are older now, so the needs also are different. But it's a wonderful time because you can have very nice conversation with them. You can engage with them from a work standpoint. So I think each phase of life is interesting, and to be able to enjoy that phase of life and find, so even with family, I think I've done a decent job, despite all the work and everything, of staying connected with family. My parents, fortunately, live 5 minutes away. My brother also lives there. So we at least see each other quite often. And my wife's parents also in town, her siblings. So, well, I think proximity helps a lot. I always tell my kids, I hope that they are in the same city where we are, because the proximity just makes sure that you're, even with friends, the ones who are proximate, they're the ones every day. Once you're far away, you stay in touch, but you don't see where you're.
And you mentioned you read a lot, right? What are the kind of most... a couple of reads from which you've kind of drawn the most, learned the most, that has stayed with you? I'm sure you've read a lot of things, but just from a life philosophy perspective, what is it that's kind of hit you the most in terms of what you've read?
I read when I was young Gandhiji's Experiments with Truth. I liked that a lot because he's a person who changed himself quite a bit, and just amazing. So
I read it when I was school. I didn't get it. I read it again now 2 years back, and it was really, really hit me. It's
it's
profound.
Just quite very profound. So I think things like that. I read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography when I was younger, and I was amazed at how one person could do so many things in a lifetime. I read a lot of books on economic development that I really enjoy. I read all kinds of books, I would say. Geopolitics, I like some. I don't read a lot of fiction. But I think on the non-fiction side, I've started reading a little bit less in terms of books, partly because, I now watch more YouTube videos where the book author will do a nice 50-minute talk, and you can listen to the talk at 2x speed in 25 minutes, get the gist. So, but I think that becomes my screen, and then decide, is it worth reading? So I read fewer, but I get the top end of the funnel is larger. And then read other stuff. People forward you so many interesting things also on WhatsApp and email. So that is also...
the number of channels have kind of increased.
And I don't really stay in touch too much with the investing world, but someone will send you something interesting, and then you'll end up reading it as well. So yeah, for me, the benchmark always was Warren Buffett, who's now 90 years old, said that all through his life he read 500 pages a day, which I don't think at my age I can even read 500 pages a day, but I always thought that was a gold standard. I mean, the reason he is who he is he reads 500 pages a day and he reflects. He cuts out all the noise in life and just focuses on these. I mean, I like Buffett saying that, there are 20 important decisions you make in your life, and if you can figure out which ones are the 20
and get them
right, like the figuring out who your spouse is, probably most important decision of your life. But there are many others such, like the profession you choose to be in, does it match who you are? Some of the choices you make are really, really important.
That requires decluttered mind, that requires clarity of thought, that requires less noise.
So I'm not quite as decluttered, but hopefully we'll get there. But I think reading helps in providing perspective.
Yeah. So Ashish, you've had an outstanding kind of run so far. It, at least from the outside, seems great, everything. But I'm sure there would have been some moment where you kind of were not kind of feeling up there, you kind of were down. Has there been such any key moment like that? Of course, there are many, in an entrepreneurial journey, there are many ups and downs, but something that was really which could have taken things in a very different direction, either in Chris Capital, CSF now. What will be your lowest moment? Let me put it that way.
So in Chris Capital, my lowest moment was in 2001 when, we stupidly had put 50% of the fund into like .com, and, basically we destroyed capital very effectively. And it was our first fund, and honestly, I felt like we could shut shop, but there was a fighting spirit in me said there's no way it's going to happen. And so we have to fight back and make it happen. So it was a low point with some self-doubt, but I think that self-doubt is good because it pushes you harder and makes you think about what you need to do to survive, and that survival instinct sort of kicks in. But it was a tough phase. It was a tough phase because I had left my job in New York, I'd come, if I had failed then, it would have been hard. You can always reset, but
something for sure.
I think when I made the transition from the corporate world, it was a little difficult because initially, you're used to doing certain things, transitioning mentally also, just dealing with different people, all of that. So it was difficult. I would say I was not sure. I had self-doubt again, whether I would even succeed.
Cut out for this
or not, I am still, at the core, I believe in markets. I mean, ideologically and all, I'm like that. But even in terms of I still wear the shirt and, I'm corporate in that sense, But I think I found my space, ultimately. I can't do what some other people do. It's their forte in terms of connect with the community, etc. But there is a place, right, for what they do, which is different from what others do. So I think finding that took a little bit of time. And then frankly, I mean, whilst I have thick skin, I think sometimes what bothers me is, when you get something going and then it just dissipates because of some bureaucrat moves on, the next person kills it after so much effort has been put in.
That's an occupational hazard.
Or people doubt, I don't want glory and fame for what I do, but people always will have doubt about why is this person funding this or have this agenda or intent. I mean, to be honest, I have no desire to get into politics. I have no desire to, I want to live a good, happy life, and I want India to do well. Baki, beyond that, I want the people who are building these institutions that we support to support them. But, you know, in India, there's always people who will, and it's not just in India, globally even. I mean, the Gates Foundation gets a lot of criticism. So again, you have to have thick skin, but it's like when you are, sometimes bothers my wife more than me. You're trying to do good and why are they criticize?
Assigning intention.
But I think we have to live with that, you know. Just accept that, move on, try to do your best. We have one life to live. Do your best, be your best, and
when you do, let's say you to hang your boots 20 years down the line, or whenever you do that, what would kind of, if you were to look back, what would give you satisfaction? You already achieved so much across.
No, I think what will give me greatest satisfaction to see India do really well. I think secondly, at my personal level, would be to have built some institutions and played some role. I'm still proud of the fact that in private equity, I created Chris Capital, where we were early. We were almost like showed that it's possible to make returns. We did it ethically, where we had some of the best global investors who invested with us, who had a good experience, made good returns, but also knew governance was good. And today I see those same investors now investing billions in India. But that first 10 million, 20 million check was with us. That makes me feel proud that we did good for our investors, we did good for our team, we did good for the companies we invested with. Same thing here. You know, if we can have 10 institutions that get created, that support government, that are sustainable institutions, that have real impact in the areas they work in, and can outlive me, I think that would make me really proud. But each of them will have their own entrepreneurial leader. I mean, like Chris Capital, I left 11 years ago. I have no equity. I'm a nobody. I mean, you know, I have to ask permission before I go to their office or use their office. They're friends of mine. But I have no rights. I have nothing. You know, I'm not on any board, nothing. And so in that sense, you know, I'm very happy to. I always believed in this attached detachment concept, right? You know. You create, you're very attached when you're doing it because you have to, that's your way. But you also are willing to, even in CSF now, I'm in that little bit of detachment phase where they run it, it's their job, I'm there to support. So I think hopefully, that can...
That's extremely powerful, right? Just that being detachment doesn't not taking away anything from your effort that you're putting in, and then but this comes a time when you say, okay, now you're doing something else. You're not kind of still stuck to the old thing.
Absolutely,
clinging on to it.
Yeah, same thing with Ashoka. What had to be done, you know, a few more years, and then Pramak is now the chairman. Yes. There are many other people, you know, etc. So focus my energy on some new things. Let them succeed. It's really the people. You know, honestly, at the end of the day, you look at it. What do I do? I'm just an organizer. Provide some money, you know, pick some area, get someone who's really good. And more than anything else, they're excellent. You know, just to support them, be there, help them in some way, build a team, put some things together. Yeah. And really, they're the ones who make it happen. So I shouldn't be taking the credit.
Great. Very interesting, Ashish. Lastly, so we talked about that the challenges here in the impact space are more complex than, let's say, on the corporate side. The other thing I also feel, and there are a lot of people working in this space. They're extremely passionate about it. They really want to kind of improve things, but there is still, I feel, not enough critical mass of what you can say top quality talent. There are outstanding people, no doubt, but the needle, I believe, will really move when, let's say, the people graduating from the best campuses in the country, they start choosing to work in the impact space as opposed to going to a McKinsey, a Google, or yesterday's unicorn. Right? That's when the needle will really, really go. You also feel that's required, that critical mass kind of starts making a choice to work in this space in whatever way. Capacity can be different, but do you also believe that?
100% believe in that, 100%. I do think it's starting to turn in that, you know, there are some very good people who have started to come into the development sector. I mean, you've seen it when Nandan and his team that's been working on digital public goods, government has now taken up in such a big way. Phenomenal people came out, worked selflessly to make it happen. They could have been earning lots of money in India, in the US, wherever, doing what they did. So I think we'll see there's many more sort of that next generation of people, whether it's in technology, finance, consulting, who either coming out of college, organizations like Gandhi Fellowship, Teach for India, YF, many others create these change makers. Many of the fellowships government runs, Prime Minister's Rural Development Fellowship, CMGGA, etc. So I think at the young level it's happening, but the typical corporate career track coming out of business school, it still hasn't happened. And I think we need to make it more aspirational for them, or even people in the corporate world, that look, I've had a corporate life and now I can switch over and I'll find a place here and I'll succeed actually. And what I do will be valued, but I'll be willing to accept somewhat lower pay, but extreme gratification. You know, when ultimately I'll tell my grandkids with pride that I did something for the country, more than making money for myself.
So and that's exactly the audience that again Sushasan kind of looks at for the best talent out there, and really inspiring them to make a shift to the impact space. What would be your pitch to them? If you were to kind of, on my behalf, kind of pitch this thing to say to the young talent, especially the young, B schools, people who've spent a few years in the corporate world, why should they look at this space? You talked a little bit about it, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the why is that firstly, these are the best of 3 decades for India, and they are critical because between now as in you go from lower middle income to developed status, best 3 years, and this is for a younger person, they've got 3 decades ahead.
India 75 to 100, right?
Yeah,
This period.
This is the best period. 2 is, I think that, you know, they can participate in nation building and work on the most complex problems, challenge themselves, push themselves, and also feel that they're connected in some way with a larger purpose, you know, being mission driven. At the end of the day, there's a certain joy in being mission driven.
Yes.
There's a certain joy in working on complex problems that challenge you every day. You know? So I think that you can get here and you won't ever be disappointed, even 5 years down the road. And a third, I think, is happening now, which is you won't be alone. I think there will be a cohort of others in your organization, other like-minded people, fellow travelers, as it were, in this journey, who you can learn with, learn from, share experiences with, and that will make it really exciting, you know, as you go on this journey. So I think it's a no-brainer if you ask me. As long as you're comfortable in your own skin, that you don't have to feel compelled to drive the Audi. When your business school classmate is driving the Audi, you're comfortable taking an Ola and being okay with it. Or you're comfortable, you know, with reasonably good, I think you can even have a good standard of life, but be more proud of what you're doing, you accomplish, but be away from the trappings and from the, in a way, false corporate success of that rat race, you know, moving from this position to that, to that, to that. If you can strip that out of your DNA and get more purpose and mission into your DNA, be okay with your expectations in terms of I think you'll be much happier and more purposeful in your journey as you go forward.
Great. Thank you, Ashish, for this conversation, and thank you for being on Sushasan, for sharing all the wisdom that you gathered through all the work that you've done over the last 2.5 decades. Thank you.
Now, you are the ultimate role model, bro. Thank you.
Thank you.